at Shailesh Mehta School of Management. He's also affiliated with Center for Policy Studies in IIT Bombay. His research and his research and teaching interests are in the area of development economics, applied econometrics, insurance markets, behavioral economics, and entrepreneurship. He has published research articles in journals such as Marketing Research, World Development, Oxford Development Studies, and Economic and Political Weekly. And other journals too. I think this is a older profile. Prior to joining SJM, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Asia Research Center of London School of Economics and Political Science and Center de Sciences Humans, CSH, New Delhi, in the well-known Parliament study. He has a PhD in economics from the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research and was a visiting doctoral scholar at Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania. He was also a scientist at the International Work in Austria in 2010. He has won 2 ILO research grants, USA visiting doctoral fellowship, 2 ICSSR research grants. He is also found the behavioral lab and GISE hub. I think it's into geospatial information and science and engineering. I think he'll talk about the hub also towards the end of the lecture. Today we'll be talking about is small still beautiful. This is a debate which has been going on for almost a decade. I think 1926 is when probably China starts this debate in Russia. But the Indian debate starts about 60 years back, I think. And there are various things that the debate has to offer, both from theoretical, practical, and policy point of view. And Sarthak will engage with all of them in this lecture. Yeah. Just one thing, online people are able to hear for online participants. If there is any issues, just send a chat saying that there are difficulties in hearing, then we could look into it. Yeah, the floor is on your stuff. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Ranganathan. Good afternoon, Professor Nagraj, and to faculty at CDS. And hello to all the students, PhD scholars, and hopefully some masters that have finished their exams by today, I hope. And hi to all the participants who are joining us online. I was very happy in the first session when Professor Mani mentioned that you've celebrated 50 years of the establishment of the Center for Development Studies. I'm very happy to introduce you to a problem which is a tad older than the Institute and perhaps much older than all of us sitting here. Hi, Ritika, you've also come in. Good to see all of you here. This is, in fact, my first in-person lecture after the pandemic, because back in IIT Bombay, I used to have online sessions. We went hybrid, but since I'm teaching game theory, I was a bit strategic. I prefer not to teach in that online mode. So it's indeed a pleasure. And thanks to CDS for inviting me for this interesting conversation between students, faculty, and speakers from across the country. I was very happy in the morning when Aniket did talk about hybrid seats, and from that we have transitioned into a hybrid session. So that's wonderful to have. And in fact, the way the seating arrangement is, I don't know who is the left-wing post-Keynesian or the right-wing post-Keynesian in a place which is named after somebody who gave us the Cambridge controversy, John Robinson. So with this background, let me quickly introduce you to what I'm going to talk about today. So over the next 45 odd minutes, I'm going to give you 3 important insights. The first one would be a bit of something called an unanticipated shock. So these are shocks that you do not plan for, that you do not anticipate well in advance. Then I'll introduce you to a debate which has spanned almost 60 years in India, and globally it's assigned to a Russian agroeconomist who was executed by Stalin and Molotov back in 1937, Alexander Shainov, but he did not study that the way you economists or development scientists should be studying. Then I'll give you an insight into some of the theoretical as well as practical quandaries that I, as a student of economics, have been facing, and the kind of issues that are popping up in the literature of late. So that is important for some of the young researchers out here to see what the frontier lies, where it is, what is the scope of this research after all. Then I'll present results based on an ongoing replication of a very recent study in the Journal of Political Economy, where there's been a replication failure. So yet to publish this work. So it'd be good to have your feedback in terms of how to really kind of get insights on the replication aspects, as well as for the youngsters out here in the importance of replication. I'll leave you with a few questions, some open, some not so open, and what could be the prospects of the future work. Now, coming to that unanticipated shock I talked about, imagine that tomorrow you wake up to a very draconian law that says that you and your family have to go to a village. You're randomly assigned to some village and you've been randomly given a plot of land. So let that sink in for you. Do not have any choice here. So the law says no matter where you are in the country, you will be forced along with your family into a village somewhere in India. You do not have the choice over the plot of land that you choose. That will be randomly assigned. Imagine some dictator doing a randomized control trial of sorts. In this context, you have a lot of choices after that decision is made though. You can actually decide whether to lease in land or to lease out the land that has been given to you, to hire in labor or hire out the labor. You can go out and work on the farms of others who've also been victims of this draconian policy. You can borrow from banks or money lenders or any agency as such, institutional or otherwise. You can buy fertilizers, you can buy pesticides, you can also get them on credit. You can buy, rent, and acquire the draft crop, the bullocks or the oxen, or the farm equipments like tractors and harvesters if you're fortunate enough to have a large enough size of land. Now, if that set of assumptions has sunk in now, that this randomized experiment by a draconian ruler has landed you in a piece of land on the landscape of the country where you have no choice over the size of the land, but you have choice over the technology of production. So if that is important in the context of today's discussion, we have to also ask this question, that will you survive by employing what you've learned in the classrooms in Microeconomics 101? Assuming that you are rational agents, you are profit maximizers, the value of marginal product is equated to the price of each of the factors of production. Would your farm survive? Would you survive? That is the first question I want all of you to keep thinking as we proceed today. The second, so amongst you, some of you would have small pockets of land or some plots of land. Others would have medium or large plots of land, large packets of land. So what is the implication of the size of land that you randomly got assigned to on the productivity of that land measured in terms of the output per acre of land? So output over that acre of land. And lastly, we'll try to understand which of these farms, given the distribution of farms, will be sustainable in the long run. So before I get into the specifics, I would like to have some preliminary responses in this room here. So who would like to respond in terms of which of these farms will survive? The small farms, the medium farms, or the large farms? And why? Any thoughts? You have capital, you have labor, you have your production technology, you know your microeconomics. Just apply that theory to practice and tell me if you think, yes, you have enough confidence that you'll be able to have not only some land which is tillable, which is getting operated by employing your family labor as well as you could hire in labor, use capital labor productively. And then you have to face the market. Then you have to face the structures that are in that society, the power distribution that is exists. And after that, are you confident that you'll be able to survive beyond a year? So how many of you can actually go out and do that farming and survive beyond a year? Please raise your hand. That means there is some confusion, there's some doubt, which is good. So let's see why it's seemingly an innocuous question has a lot of practical implications that despite our education, we're not confident to go out there and sustain a small farm or a large farm or a medium farm. Now, this question that Professor Tyagu did talk about had 60 years of history in India. Could you please forward to the next slide, please? Is not in the sense that it originated in India, but it was largely the writings of Amartya Sen back in 1962 in the Economic and Political Weekly, which was then the Economic Weekly, where he used data from the farm management studies. So these are surveys that have been conducted across different states of India. Very detailed data on inputs and outputs are being collected. Like an economist would do, Professor Sen observed that the small farms, he in fact coined the term efficient. I'll debate that today here, and so that he believed that, and he found that small farms are more efficient than the large farms. Now, back in 1926, go back to the story of Alexander Shainov, who was executed by the thugs of Stalin and Molotov. He had been studying the data from the Zemstvo, the organizations that were in Imperial Russia. They collected very detailed data from 1880, and the data was also continued beyond the fall of the Imperial in Soviet Russia. You have data till 1930. So almost 50 years of data was available, perhaps the most sophisticated analysis of agricultural economics pre-1947 for a reference point for India. So when Professor Sen came out and said there is an inverse relationship between productivity in terms of output per acre of land and the farm size, there was an intense debate that followed. Almost on a regular basis, as if every week these eminent scholars are trying to negate this finding or maybe confirm the hypothesis out there, we had a very productive phase in Indian academia where very eminent economists, they contributed in the sense of what is happening here. What is the reason that small farms, A, would be more productive than large farms, and B, is it indeed a stylized fact of Indian agriculture? Is it a statistical regularity? So I have referred to several of these contributions. I'll share the slides where you have several references. So you find that the three broad questions that emerged was, can we generalize this for the Indian agriculture as such? Is it a generalizable proposition or is it a spurious correlation? I believe all of you know the difference between a spurious correlation and a causation. Can anybody give me an example of a spurious correlation? Anybody from the right-wing side? You're saying there is no theoretical basis for that causation, it is just spurious. Good. Similarly, there may be a spurious correlation between farm size and productivity, depending on how the data is collected, how it's aggregated, how it's analyzed. Another interesting point was something I would like to spend a little bit more time towards the end was by Professor Krishna Bharadwaj. She would say that we need to understand that this neoclassical way of maximizing profits is not going to work out here. So that value of marginal product is equal to the price of the farm, the market price of the factors of production. That is not going to work here because you have to understand the power structures in that society. You have to understand that there is a bargaining power at work here. There are interlocked markets that you must have heard in today's sessions earlier. So what you have to now understand is why would this interlocked markets and the bargaining power and the observations coming in from different parts of the country really challenging this hypothesis. So one basic understanding was that the small farmers, now go back to that thought experiment we did. If you manage to have a small piece of land what did you use more intensively? Would that be capital or would that be your labor, which is mostly your family labor? So depending on your family sizes, you'd say that's the most immediate thing for me to have. So given the state of development in the region you happen to be, you will say I'll use it more intensively. That was also the argument that Professor Sen had earlier. So there also a lot of questions emerge. Perhaps there's an issue of comparability of family labor with hired labor. Can anybody tell me why that is a concern? That you can't just compare the two types of labor very simply. Family labor versus hired labor. Yes. Can be seated and respond, please. Okay. Okay, so you were taking the supervision aspect to it. There's a more fundamental aspect to it, which is called shadow wages. So when you're talking about the market wages and the family labor that is being utilized here, is it getting supplied in the market? No. So there is an imputed wage that is brought in here. So there is this important concept of shadow wages that really was very important in these analyses. They will say if it is not possible to equate the family labor and you evaluate it at the market price. So A, there are a lot of construction issues there. B, in the sense of having a hired labor, that supervision cost is also an important point. And then you slowly see that the country is growing over a period of time. There is structural transformation taking place. And all of you must have read Professor Nagaraj's contributions in how the Indian economy has grown, what have been the challenges, the definitional issues, the methodological issues. So all this is happening in the background as we speak today. So you fast forward to a few years, and economists have by the time given several explanations for A, why this is a statistical regularity, or whether it's an artifact or it's a fact in that sense. So some of the classical arguments have been that factor markets are imperfect. Land, labor, capital, credit in that sense. So these are some of the important contributions. I did refer to Professor Bhardwaj's work. So there's a lot of debate happening around the 70s and late 80s about in terms of the mode of production debate. So these days, the contemporary economists not really engage with these sort of arguments, even though you have a Marxist orientation at times, you do refer to in a passing sense in terms of the mode of production debate, referring to the differentials in productivity. There might be applications in other areas, but we're talking about the classical debate here. Risk aversion, interestingly, came out as a topic. So can anybody tell me why risk aversion would be an explanation for this inverse farm-size relationship with productivity? Imagine that you are a risk-averse farmer. You have a small piece of land. Why would you be more productive or less productive compared to somebody who has a larger piece of land? Would you like to hazard a guess? Is it because you believe the outside options are not there, or is it because you feel that since I'm risk averse, I can't take on risk, maybe I can't be an entrepreneur, I'm not going to perhaps diversify to non-farm, or I can diversify. So think through this question, because as Professor Thiago told me earlier today, that the objective of these lecture series is also to provoke you and encourage you to think deeper. So in that context, there's some distortion, please. So I'll not really give out direct answers. I'll suggest you a few readings, but you think as we discuss. Now, another aspect has been that two farmers are very different farmers. So your skill sets are very different. So if there is a difference or heterogeneity in your skill sets, maybe these productivity differentials are arising because of that and not because of the kind of assumptions or the arguments that have been propounded. So in this context, over the past 20 years, so there has been a lot of work in the context of unobserved heterogeneity across the plots of land. So remember, all of you had different plots of land. Some of these plots were perhaps more productive than other plots of land. In this context, you have to ask this question that if there's unobserved heterogeneities or differentials are in fact causing this inverse relationship, and the poor economist crunching the numbers who does not have that data because this is unobserved, mostly done in cross-sectional data, then the productivity differentials are happening because of those heterogeneities, not because of what you propound to be the cause here. No, so in the past few years, although over these decades, theorists have really been happy to jump into this debate because after all, they're getting a bit jealous. They're seeing this empirists, they're having a field day, they're getting data from different countries for a longer period of time if you're fortunate enough, and you're able to publish all this work, then what should a theorist do? A theorist is saying, I'll theorize. So these theorists have been positing that if your markets are perfect, this inverse relationship should not exist. So go back to the earlier arguments that the empirists are giving, or the statisticians, the economists are giving. They're giving arguments like there are imperfect markets out there. This is why we should have these sort of observations. But the theorists are saying, look, if the markets are perfect, you should not have an inverse relationship. Go back to that same experiment we began with. So all of you have been in different parts of India with different sizes of land and different access to capital labor, different production functions. Now, who could tell me why at this point that there are market imperfections in your society? You see that some of your friends or some of your neighbors are more productive than you. What would you do there? If the land markets, the labor markets, the capital markets, they're imperfect, that's in a way becoming a barrier for you to acquire a larger piece of land or maybe some factors of production and so on. But the theorists are saying if you remove these market imperfections, an inverse relationship should not exist. Can anybody tell me why that should happen? Just imagine that you see your neighbors are more productive than you. Neighbor is a small farmer, hence more productive by that logic. So what would you like to do if you have a bigger plot of land? Correct. But then if there are imperfections in the leasing out market or the tenancy market, that would be a barrier. So then what you do, if there is no barrier, there is no imperfection in that sense, then you are going to have an equalization of these productivities. It's like everyone, the village will have the same access to technology, same level of capital intensity, same labor intensity, and so on. So the productivities will equalize. So it is in that context that somewhere around late 90s, because then perhaps economists were tired of this topic. They got into some more fancy topics and the debates and so on, and see this is post-reforms. And then 1997, a very interesting paper by Chattopadhyay and Sengupta comes in that says, in West Bengal, by this time, Indian agriculture has become sufficiently developed. It's been over 30 years of the Green Revolution. They found that in certain pockets of this agriculturally developed parts of West Bengal, the inverse relationship exists. And then for almost a decade, there was as if a silence among the economists in particular. No one wanted to bother themselves with this question. So that's when Ramesh Chand came with an interesting article in 2011 in the EPW using aggregate data from the National Sample Survey. So that's when Professor Srijit Mishra, who spoke before Professor Aniket, in fact, one important aspect you should know that there is an intergenerational aspect to some of these research questions. So Professor Srijit Mishra was my advisor. He introduced me to this debate. And somehow I have introduced my doctoral student to this topic. So the replication exercise that we're talking about is a joint work between 3 generations of academics. And we couldn't somehow rope in Professor Ahmed Descent, could have in a much bigger intergenerational exercise. So the idea here is when we revisited this with National Sample Survey data from the 59th round situation assessment survey, we found that there is in fact an inverse relationship using cross-sectional data. well being aware of all these decades of explanations, the limitations, the literature and everything, we felt very humble in a sense that for the national level, even at the NSS region level, we're able to not reject that null hypothesis of an inverse relationship. Pretty well knowing that this is a cross-sectional data. There will be questions about unobserved heterogeneities that we could not have controlled for. But where is that panel data that we're looking for? So it is in this context that the last few years, in fact, the last 4 to 5 years, several studies have been published in this context, mostly coming in from Africa, where they find a very different response. Does anybody know what is the fundamental distinction between the land sizes in Africa and in India? In the US or the Western European context, you might guess that they're very large farms. What about Africa? Any guesses? Do you think Africa, how many countries are there in Africa, the continent? So when I say Africa, you shouldn't assume it to be like one country, right? So there are over how many countries? In fact, precisely how many countries? Does anybody know? Does anybody want to take a guess? Over 20, over 30, over 40, over 50? Somewhere between 50 to 60, 50 to 55. That's also an open question. Please figure it out. Then you realize that different continents have different distributions of land. You need to ask this question, why is it so? Why is it that in India, the land sizes, as we've been talking about, are becoming smaller and smaller? In Africa, they have a different distribution. In the US, it's a different distribution. The average sizes of land, when I demonstrate the variations between India and other countries, you realize this is mind-boggling. Why is that happening is a question that all of you should deeply think about. But interestingly, in the context of the Indian data that is coming in from Professor Foster and Rosenzweig, a paper that is recently published in the Journal of Political Economy, the one that we replicated, in fact, failed to replicate, you'll find that they said in India, in recent times, there is a U-shaped relationship, no more inverse relationship. For certain sizes of land, with increase in land, the IR will hold, the productivity will decline. After it hits 24.5 acres, then it will start shooting up. So all of you have just finished your microeconomics. What does this remind you of? When I say it's a U-shaped relationship between size of land, after all, an input in the production system or production function, and output, what comes to mind? Would like to take a guess? What comes to mind? Nothing comes to mind? Anything that comes to mind would do. Think about it. Imagine that there's a, forget the farm, think of the firm. So you're a firm and you're increasing a certain input, and you're seeing that the output is initially falling, then it is rising beyond a point. It's a U-shaped. So what comes to mind? Any other guesses you'd like to guess? Or does anybody know I'm saying too many guesses? No, I'm talking it's a U-shape, not an inverted U-shape. So what comes to mind? The total productivity curve has a different curvature, different shape altogether, but fine, it's linked. We'll see what is the linkage, don't worry. Now, what happened is, so they're saying that this U-shaped relationship is existing because of labor market transaction costs and the machine capacity with scale. So this is a point I'm going to refute, that when you're trying to explain the farm size productivity debate, do not interchange scale and size. For the young researchers out here, it's a very important distinction. Even if you're going to work with firms or countries or anybody who has the technology to transform inputs into outputs, do not get confused between size and scale. So this is one of the theoretical quandaries, in fact. And some important insights are also coming in terms of the measurement issues. Some researchers recently have questioned your measures of output, your measures of area. The denominator is area, the numerator is output. They're saying if you're measuring this with errors, there's going to be a problem. And what happens if you could control for that? So this is in fact the frontier of this research, and this is one of the reasons there are diverse results. So another reason that we have figured out why there are diverse results is because there are diverse theoretical assumptions guiding your studies. Many times there is no theory guiding some of these studies. They'll just take the data, follow a garbage in, garbage out framework. You'll find some relationship, you publish that. So one of the reasons for me to really have this interaction is to warn you against these kind of studies. So what is your theoretical motivation has to be laid out up front, or think deeply about the challenges in theory. Empirics part, we discuss about the econometric issues. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but also tell you why you need to be careful. So some students one day asked me, why are you still working on this problem if you worked on it 10, 15 years back? My answer is I kind of like this debate. It's an academic debate. It's intellectually stimulating. It's my choice to work on it. But there are also interesting policy reasons for why one should be abreast of what is happening in this debate. The land distribution policies. If some economist in the corridors of power in Delhi somehow convinces the government or the powers that be that large farmers are more productive, so who can tell me what should be the implication for land redistribution in India? Should there be a ceiling on land, or should we have collectivization of land? What should be a policy? Collectivization. Why? Because bigger pockets of land are more productive, then aggregate productivity would increase, the food security issues would be taken care of, the role of agriculture development could be worked out nicely, and so on. So this question has immense policy implications. So what you have to realize is that it is also in a way a bearing on how the green revolution trajectory is worked out. We know that today you heard in the earlier session that the Western UP, Haryana and Punjab, this North Indian states and the regions therein had a very different trajectory than Vidarbha and Marathwada and other parts which are mostly dryland regions or semi-arid tropics, as you will see. Now, certain crops are just not getting that sort of an impetus from the public research, from the extension services system like the wheat paddy systems that we saw. And the current repeal of the farm laws, who was protesting in Delhi? Was it farmers from Vidarbha and Marathwada mostly, or farmers from Punjab, Haryana and Western UP? The wheat and paddy growers? Is the latter, right? So you realize there's the political economy of this farm protest, the whole problem is, if you're politically aware of how this research or the implications thereof could be leveraged for your agenda setting and for pushing your agenda, you could utilize it. So it has a political relevance as well. And then there are ecological challenges all of us have been listening about, the sustainability issues, the planetary boundaries. Does anybody know what is a planetary boundary? It's not the multiverse where DC Marvel talk about. It is a different planetary boundary. The hint is sustainability. And when I said small is beautiful or it's small, still beautiful, the reference was also to a planetary boundary. Does anybody know what is Anthropocene? The Holocene, the Anthropocene. All of you know that climate change is a bad thing, normatively, right? Global warming, climate change, and all. So what has agriculture got to do with it? What has productivity of smallholders got to do with it? Any answers? Okay, so this is another thing that we need to discuss and read up much more on. So I'll drive home the importance of that. And this is what I talked about earlier. There are two important trends that you need to be aware of, that in India, the average size of land has been declining secularly. And if you see that it is not just the average size of the land holdings falling secularly, there's also been a decline in the total cultivated area. All of you have done your basic Indian economy, I believe. Right, Kritika? So all of the students here have done it. So can anybody tell me why the total cultivated area would fall in India? After all, the Indian economy has grown and Professor Nagaraj's contributions are immense in helping us navigate that debate, be it the real growth rates or the measurement issues and so on. why would the land area cultivated fall in total? Any guesses?
Yes, yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
It's because of fragmentation.
Mhm.
85, more than 85% of our farmers are medium and small and marginal farmers. So when the holding size becomes really small, it may not even sustain the basic livelihood, the basic need of those people. And rather than cultivating, incurring cost, and many a times they don't even get the returns what they invest on. So it's better they leave it just like that.
Okay, so
And
Yogesh,
tendency also has, yeah,
so is that a push factor or a pull factor?
it's a push kind of factor, which
Okay.
makes people to move out of the agriculture and seek.
Some of you to think about this alternative, the contrarian view that there could be pull factors. You see non-farm growth, look at Kerala here, there's so much of construction, there's so much of remittances coming in. Would you prefer to work in the farm sector or non-farm sector? There are two sides to it, in fact. But irrespective of that stunted structural transformation that we have, in fact, because of that, to a large extent, you see there's been a reduction in the total area that is cultivated. So when the total area is cultivated, and let's say there is a target productivity level that the government or the country has to meet, what is the only way you could do that? Imagine that tomorrow, the economists would announce that in India, the absolute level of land available for cultivation has fallen by 50%. But India has to meet its food production targets for food security and so on. What is the only way you could still meet that food production level or even non-food production levels, be it cotton or the cash crops? By using technology to do what? To increase your productivity. Good. So you're saying that that productivity is still relevant, right? So we see that given the trajectories of your economic growth, the redistribution of the sectoral composition in the economy, no matter whether you look at it through the employment lens or through the share of the GVA lens, that is still relevant. And one important trend that you see on the graph on the right, so the steepest fall in the total area has been for the large farm size group, the red one at the bottom. And the steepest rise has been for this small and marginal group put together, the marginal as a category in itself. So in a simple sense, you realize that one of the important trends in that stunted structural transformation has been what we call the marginalization of land holdings in India. So that also is the context where 86% of the holdings and nearly half of the operated area are small and marginal, less than 2 hectares of land, around 5 acres of land. Now, why this question is important in the context of the first question that I asked is that very likely when that randomization is happening, you and your family would have been endowed with just 5 acres of land. Just 5 acres of land. Around 10% of rest of the country would have been endowed with greater than 5 acres of land. So you'd be endowed with, on an average, in fact, modally, you'd be endowed with a small parcel of land. So whatever responses you had earlier to my first question now gets a reference point. Now, would some of the technologies that you thought about, some of the cropping patterns that you thought about, some of the aspirations that you set, would that be feasible with that land size? How many of you think that would still be feasible at 5 acres or less than 5 acres? It's not feasible, right? So in its construction itself, this problem is very important. You have to realize that if you read this problem in the context of the macroeconomic trends and the trends in the Indian economy, the salience of this problem should not be forgotten by contemporary scholars and researchers. It's continuing to be important in India's agriculture development trajectory. Can anyone give me one theory of development that you've been taught? The Center for Development Studies, right? So you study development. So any theory of development that comes to mind, even if you have not been introduced to it formally, I believe in your conversations, you must have been introduced to any theory of development. Good. So what is Malthus's theory? The population is growing, let's say, right? So let's say you got your land in that thought experiment, you're having good output, the population is growing. So what happens to the population growth eventually? Would it continue to grow? Forever? There'll be resource constraints, there'll be food security concerns, right? So at some point you will hit that roadblock and you realize that, no, we need to re-engineer some of our production systems, our cropping systems have to be reconstructed or maybe redesigned. And what Professor Aniket Aga talked about a bit back, why is there so much of discussion around the genetically modified cotton or the genetically modified brinjal or BT brinjal? Is it simply because it is a transgenic seed, or it's ending your seed sovereignty, or there's something else to it? So one camp who would be supporting the introduction of the genetically modified organisms per se, GMOs, be it BT cotton and otherwise, that argument is pretty much Malthusian. How else would you increase the levels of production when your average land sizes are falling, total land for cultivation that is available is falling? It's only through greater productivity. And what sort of a technology is that BT cotton seed that Professor Aniket talked about? Is it a labor-saving technology? Is it a land-augmenting technology? Is it a labor-displacing technology? What do you think is that seed, which is increasing the productivity? In fact, if you read his book, you'll realize that that productivity story died within a decade of its introduction. 2001 is when BT cotton was legalized in India for commercial release. 2011 is when the fall in that productivity started happening. So farmers all over India today are not really getting those sort of productivity gains. In fact, it's stagnated or fallen, right? But what did BT cotton do over those 10 years since its introduction? Raised the production of cotton in India. India's exports of cotton would go up given the demand for cotton domestically. So what sort of technology is that? Any seed that is making you produce more with the same patch of land or same piece of land, does it have a name? Think of a fancy name that would also do for our discussion today. I ask you to name a technology that will let you produce more with the same level of inputs. What would you name it? If you had to write fiction also, that's fine. Yeah. Land-saving technology. That's a good answer. You're saving land to a large extent. You're not saving labor. We'll see whether that happens. There's something called a land-augmenting technology. There's something called a land-saving. You think, are they the same? So you have to read about it. So what has also happened over the last 20 years, that the real incomes of farmers across the country has fallen. So look at these structural changes. The non-farm diversification story has been pretty much intact. The farm sizes are falling, total land is falling, farmers' incomes are falling, agrarian distress is what Jaideep Hardikar talked about in the morning. Farmers' suicides is something that Sujit Mishra and Jaideep have been writing about for decades. So what you have to now realize is that this question of farm size productive debate, rather than being obsolete and unessential to our contemporary discourse in economics, should in fact be much more prevalent. Researchers should be writing about this. But since Professor Tyagu told me that all of you love econometrics, I'll have a few questions on econometrics for all of you. So if you know that there is a basic production function of the form of equation 1, where the log of the ratio of output to the area, which is log of yield in that sense, is regressed on the log of area and log of x or controlling for other factors, how would you interpret that beta 1 coefficient? Look at equation 1. So y is the self-reported farm output. The farmer is saying this is my output. A is the self-reported area. The farmer is saying this is my area. So what is the ratio of output and area? It's yield, production per acre of land, kgs per acre or quintals per hectare and so on. So who can interpret beta 1 coefficient? Is there a more fancy name for that? Elasticity, just elasticity. Some elasticity. Okay, so I'll take that. Now, elasticity is like this rubber band, right? You're saying you're increasing that variable A by a certain percentage. By how much is that dependent variable, that yield is increasing? Now, to test the inverse relationship, what should be your hypothesis? Can you guess what should be your hypothesis about beta 1? Should it be equal to 1, greater than 1, less than 1? Small farmers are more productive. That is your working hypothesis, right? What is that empirical equivalent of that? If the size of land is increasing by 1%, the percentage of output should be greater than 1, less than 1. Be increasing in proportion or decreasing in proportion. Bigger farmers should be more productive or less productive? Less productive. So they're moving in opposite directions. So that beta 1 should be less than 1. Very good. So you just developed a fancy hypothesis which economists have been doing for the past 60 years. In fact, in the more traditional sense, they work with ratios. But in this sense, since you have taken the log models, you're working with this elasticities as you rightly pointed. So whenever you see literature using data about the inverse farm size relationship, people are actually testing for beta 1 to be less than 1. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Another popular specification is what you see in your textbooks, the production function approach. You're taking area, you're taking capital, you're taking labor. So which of these is the most difficult to measure? Since we're sitting in the Joan Robinson Hall, which of these do you think is the most difficult to measure? And I talked about the Cambridge controversy in the beginning. It had a capital attached to it, right? So also read up on the capital Cambridge controversy or the Cambridge controversy in that sense. And how do you aggregate this capital to get the macro sense of capital? So that is also applicable to our measurement issues in farm size, but of late people have shied away from it. Remember that in any empirical literature, if there is a debate, it is going to be either theoretical or it is going to be practical in that sense. There could be a mix of the two coming from this. So much of these two are happening in this literature. You have theoretical issues with conceptualization, the terms, the definitions, and so on. You have practical issues. We do not know what is the best way to measure land, what is the best way to measure output, what is the best way to measure capital and labor. So if you understand these basic econometric questions, you're good enough to be the next contributor to this literature. So with that optimism, let me introduce you to a very simple econometric model that wants to hypothesize that this inverse relationship happens because of household specific differences. So remember I told you much of the literature is with cross-sectional data, that too at a farm level. If I give you a panel data at the plot level, how many of you would be excited to do some econometrics? I believe Econometrics 101 has been introduced, Vasudhavu? Yes. So what is the fundamental distinction between a panel data and a cross-sectional data? And those in the online space could also respond to it. In other words, if I hand you over quality panel data, compared to those who are working on cross-sectional data, what would be your advantage in contributing to this literature? Change over time, you're seeing time series also, isn't it? Same units that are being followed over a period of time. So what is the advantage of that? Very good. And you must have come across this thing called fixed effects, right? So there are certain time invariant factors such as gender, caste, religion, skills. Is it time invariant? Ability, is it time invariant? So there are also issues. Just because you have panel data doesn't mean that you can deal with issues of endogeneity, as we'll see, but there are issues of unobservable kind of heterogeneities that you could assume to be taken care of through fixed effects. So here is a specification that is an extension of the top-down model we saw with two factors. It is a three-factor. A is area, K is capital, and L is labor. So there is some mumbo-jumbo happening which all of you are comfortable with. And the specification says that output per acre does not depend on area. So this is a very interesting study. I have referred to this, and this is also a reading suggestion. So I request all of you to please revise and go through it if you haven't. So this is a very interesting study that says that we could hypothesize that productivity should not depend on area or farm size. What should be the underlying assumptions for that? So as students of development studies and economics, you'd know that the power of these assumptions is important. If you see that TI term here, so none of you asked me what is TI, what is small TI. So this is the capital TI is a technology factor. Does anybody know what is total factor productivity? TFP. Why do we have an error term when we regress something on something else? And you have so many distributional assumptions your faculty would have tortured you with. Why do we have distributions of error terms? When is your econometrics exam? It's over, right? Okay. Good. So you are not going to measure everything. That there could be a lot of issues, and even getting hands-on to that. So there are omitted variables, there are measurement errors, and so on. And you have these assumptions about those error terms being random errors or white noise errors, and so on. So what you'll realize, if you just tinker with these basic assumptions and try to work around some equivalence of productivity and area or input measures, you can actually come up with some interesting breakthrough here. So this is one of those studies. That something we tried to implement and run with Equiset data. This is the International Crop Research Institute for Semi-Arid Tropics. This is a very productive data set. In fact, those of you who want to work on agriculture economics or even related issues in terms of the applications of issues in the farm applied to the farm, organizational issues or issues of behavior also, you could use this data set. So we did plot level regressions for within household variation. Because that between and within effects are important in this literature, the fixed effects will control for unobserved time invariant heterogeneities, but endogeneities will still remain. We followed a production function approach. We put in the labor intensity. So this data set has information on labor hours. How many hours of work you and your family members are putting in. We have information on the plot location. Why is the location of plot important? Anybody? Like who among this group has ever been to a plot of land which is used for cultivation? So there's some sense of fertility differentials or some set of soil quality differentials, which is in fact an important debate in the 70s and 80s. The irrigation infrastructure differs, the cost could also be factored in. Supervision cost, as you mentioned, is also an important aspect of economic theorizing. You talk about organizational context, you talk about IO literature, and all supervision cost matters. So the data is the Equiset VDSA, the village dynamics. So what you have to understand is village level studies, they've been conducted since 1975. So you have a fairly large enough panel data of a few villages in India. These are sample of households from the villages. That is giving you seasonal variation, that is giving you interannual variation, it is giving you subplot level data. In fact, I mentioned my PhD student, Rahul, who has in fact become an expert on this Equiset data over a year. He has understood that the subplot level data gives you enough variations that are important in this literature. And you have to also understand that general endowment schedule is more like the general household blocks you have in national sample survey data. We need input-output data. We have good controls for household characteristics. A word of caution, so do not just jump into running your models with Equiset data. I mentioned Rahul, he spent 6 months cleaning the data. And as we speak, he's also cleaning the data. It's a dynamic data in that sense. So no two definitions will be the same at times. No two researchers using the same data will give you the same results at time. Even Equiset has two different data sets. One is a more refined data, one is which you might have wrongfully used for your PhD thesis or master's thesis. So be careful. There's a word for caution. This is feeding into my point about replicability. So replication research is important, not so popular in Indian universities. The moment you read a good paper, you're excited about it, or you're skeptical about it, try replicating it. Discuss with your faculty as to what are the challenges to replication. In fact, in the benefit of science, you should publish your replication results. Maybe you replicated it wrongfully, right? So the third part, you'll get to know that are replication challenges. This is the semi-arid tropics that Dr. Aniket also talked about earlier. So these have mostly dryland agricultural systems, mostly red-fed, poor degraded soils. Minimum rainfall is around 400, maximum is around 1200. Not that bad compared to arid regions. These are semi-arid regions. So the length of the growing period of the LGP is around 75 to 180 days, and it is contributing to more than 1/3 of India's geographical area. And some of the crops like cotton that Professor Tiago and I have been researching, so LGP of 90 to 120 days is precisely what the semi-arid tropics is offering. So the farmer suicide belt, which are the cotton belts of India, with Telangana, Vidarbha, even in Marathwada these days, is also because of the nature of the SAT interact with the socio-political and economic systems. And recently there was a scholar from IIT Bombay, Padmaja, who is at Equiset. She studied the social aspects there. So Rahul would be studying the social networks of Equiset. So for your information, so you do not have a large enough sample for each year. It's around 900 households. But the moment you go to the cultivation schedule, so because of the raw data collected at multiple time intervals for subplot level I mentioned, you have millions of data points. So therein, the journals, the mainstream journals that have been publishing the research from Equiset data, they're some of the best journals that we aspire to publish in. So you have to not worry about the credibility of this data set. There is an excellent team of researchers and administrators who are working in Equiset. If you go to Equiset website, you'll find that during the kind of 75 to 2005 onwards, around 40 PhDs used this Equiset for different rounds and so on, different themes, hundreds of journal publications. But still, we don't know whether the data is clean enough, hence the word of caution. So this is the farm size distribution for Equiset data. It's not representative of the Indian agriculture I presented earlier. Any answers as to why? Why is Equiset data not representative of Indian agriculture? Yes. Very good. It's semi-arid tropics. It's I told you 1/3, greater than 1/3 of Indian agriculture. In that sense, it's not Indian agriculture. So don't overclaim that in that sense. It's also got a land size distribution, which you have to be aware of. The advantage of why international scholars have been using the Equiset data compared to national sample survey data, apart from the panel data nature, is it has an over-representation of the large size group. So in this data set, you will see that large farmers, greater than 4 hectares of land, we on an average around less than 8 hectares of land, but they are overrepresented compared to their representation in the national surveys. So if you really want to test a farm size productivity question that has a decent enough observations or number of observations on the right hand side of your tail of the distribution, which is the large farmers, this is a great data set. And you also understand that over time, since 2009, these are the latest 5 rounds of data that we have in this wave. So there's been an improvement in irrigation. Farmers are also using a lot of inputs intensively. So all those details are there in the slides that will be there. But one thing I'd like to draw your attention to is how intensively the small and marginal farmers are using family labor. So we have data on the labor hours that is provided in the Equiset data. We've converted that to hours per acre. And you can separate family labor from hired labor. The earlier question I asked you. So your prediction was that the small marginal farmers will do it more intensively compared to the larger farmers. And that is what the Equiset data also tells us. And the order of magnitudes are also very different. The marginal farmer, on an average, they are providing around 200 hours per acre in the season, compared to the larger farmers who are doing around 70 to 80 hours. So who is hiring more? The larger farmers, right? But when you look at the cost implications, you'll see that it is not so. And if you read the kind of results that we have shared here, you will find that that has implications on the cost of cultivation, which is relatively not low for the smallholders. So despite the fact that the smallholders, in fact, this is an important bit, the input intensity for non-labor aspects, if I hide the labels in the x-axis, it will be difficult for you to say who is a small farmer, who is a large farmer. In fact, here the small and marginal are towards the right side of the plot. You'll see that certain inputs, they're doing it at least as intensively as the large farmers. So these are the non-labor inputs. You have chemicals, you have fertilizers, you have organic matter, you have seed, mushroom. Seed is important because you just came out of a session on seed. Why is it that if you see the smallholders, the seed cost per acre is so high for the small and the marginal farmers? Seed is that purple one, which is the first bar for the smallholders. Why is it so high for the smallholders? One question came as a follow-up to what Professor Aga presented, right? Is, do smallholders have access to BT cotton seeds and so on? I said, yes, they do have. This is in fact a reflection of his response. You will find that even if you're small and marginal, you are still buying a 450 gram packet of BT cotton. You need two 450 gram packets for an acre of cotton, and you're paying the same market price as the large farmers. In fact, if you do it more intensively, you will buy one more packet. So in terms of that most important input in the production process, which is seed, where the farmers have lost their sovereignty, you have to interpret this nominal terms and the real terms beyond the economic sense. You'll see that there is an ecological aspect thereon. The moment you are migrating to a BT or a GM seed, it's not simply a new variety of seed. Your ecosystem is affected by it. The cattle economy is affected by it. There are several general equilibrium effects that you need to be aware of. So when I share the slides, please read these results very carefully, and I'd be happy to receive your interpretation of these results. I'll share my email ID. Do write down your interpretation of these 4 or 5 slides about the economics of production by farm size. Now, profitability, as you see, has a very different story to tell. In a per acre basis, a smallholder earlier was in a way productive, but we find that now that productivity doesn't hold good. I'll show that final result. But look at the levels of profit that the smallholders are having. So if you see that over this 5-6 rounds that we have, the smallholders are not able to breach the 50,000 rupee of absolute profit per year, whereas these large ones are at least 3 to 4 times higher. Sometimes they're 6 times higher. The question of variability is important. Also, the absolute level is important. So when you're talking about your productivity gains, even if in your regressions you turn out to be more productive than the large farmers, in terms of the absolute levels of your profits, you're 1/4 or 1/5. And for each of these inputs, you're having a very different interlocking of the markets that you have to be aware of. The real cost benefit analysis are not what you see in your analysis here. So the objective of really bringing to the fore this important distinction, and this is the regression that we conducted using different definitions of farmers. So one question I always have is, who is a farmer in India? Right? The politicians who own, let's say, 60 acres of land is sitting in Delhi or the state headquarters as MLAs, for instance. They are farmers. They might be getting benefits from the Pradhan Mantri's DBTs, right? There could be a definition of farmer based on the hours of labor that you supply, whether you supply more than half of your total labor hours, salary labor, or the other is hired labor. You can define the farmer. The way the National Sample Survey has been defining farmers in the situational assessment survey, that has also been dynamic. The 59th round, we talked about the farmer. The 78th and the 77th round of SAS, we're talking about an agricultural household. And the definition has a monetary component to it. In the 70th round, that this household should have at least how many rupees from agriculture per year? 3,000 rupees in absolute terms from agriculture activities. And there is an employment aspect. At least one member from the household should be employed in agriculture and allied activities as principal or subsidiary status. In the 77th round, we just updated that to 4,000 rupees. But in the 59th round, which Professor Sujit Mishra and my work is based on, we had to use the definition that NSS had of a farmer and the farmer household. You have to have operational land, either its own land or land otherwise possessed. So what you have to now realize is that definition of farmer itself, and the farm itself is not static. So here we've given you, let's say, 5 or 6 or 7 definitions of a farmer. So irrespective of how we define a farmer, the inverse relationship doesn't hold good with the Equiset data in the latest round. But that's where the pain begins. There are so many other variables in a model that I have not shown here. They, particularly controls, have a lot of interesting policy relevance. So once you realize that the IR is not holding good, was a prediction of economists 70 years back that if the economy is agriculturally advanced enough, if the labor market imperfections are improving over a period of time, if that smallholder is able to access a tractor, or let's say some other draft power or some seeds which the large holder is also having, then why should there be a difference? And this is an indictment of that sort of critiques to the contrarians there. But now coming on to some theoretical quandaries, I'll be loyal to the title here. I'll present 3 quandaries. The first I merged with the empirics here, which was who is a farmer? So you have to be careful that whenever you do such studies, you be explicit about your assumptions about the definitions of farm and the farmer, because there is sensitivity one is aware of. The second one is going to trouble you a little bit, is about the distinction between size and the scale. How many of you know what is a returns to size? Returns to scale, all of you must have seen your textbooks, right? Microeconomics. Increasing returns to scale, constant returns to scale, decreasing returns to scale. How many of you heard of returns to size or economies of size for that matter? Because what are we talking about for the past 40 minutes? Size or scale? Size. The thought experiment, the size was determined by that draconian ruler, right? Where is scale coming into the picture, then? What is scale after all? Does anybody know what is the distinction between size and scale? Any interpretations of what you've already read on this slide here? So never forget that when you talk about scale, always talk about changing all the inputs together in the same proportion. What happens to the output because of that is whether it is IRS, DRS, or CRS. But you have to always be careful that when you talk about size, you're talking about size of that input or the level of that input, size of land, level of labor that is provided, and so on. When you're talking about scale, let's say there's capital, labor, and land, all these 3 have to be changed in the same proportion. You have to increase them or decrease them is a different question. So one homework for all of you is understand that there is a relationship between elasticity of scale and elasticity of size. Both of them have implications on the average cost of the farm, all the farm. So what happens is, in fact, a good exercise is if you revisit your macroeconomics, wherever you see a farm, replace the I with an A. It becomes the farm. And train and then just think through, like what would change in that theory? When you talk about this definition, I'll take a minute here. If you want to increase the level of output, as a firm, you want to do that. You're producing 20 cars, you want to produce 40 cars, you take a call, how should I increase my factors of production? Can a farmer do that? Can you do that as a farmer? Why can't you do that? If the farmer is saying, I'm going to double my land, right? There's so many things. Let's say you can double your land. Would that guarantee you a doubling or more than doubling of your output? Why is it so? The other factors, there's stochasticity, there's this random error, there's systematic errors, the shocks. So what you have to now ask is, if there is a policy that says, let's double farmers' output, or it doubles farmers' income, what is problematic with that? I'll twist that question a little bit. To double farmers' income, would you like to play around with scale or with size? How many of you are saying scale? Raise your hand. How many are saying size? How many are saying neither? Okay. How many are saying I'm not political? That's also fine. So you also heard Professor Srijit Mishra talked about the Orissa Millets mission, right? Having learned so much about scale, size, farm size, productivity and all, do you think there'd be certain returns to scale in millets? Either increasing, decreasing, or constant, right? So what do you think would that be? Then I'll inform Professor Mishra about your views. In fact, I can call him up immediately and say, this is what the future researchers, scholars are thinking about Orissa Millets mission. IRS, DRS, CRS, choose one. That means those farmers are growing millets. You have to increase all their inputs, let's say, or decrease all their inputs at the same time. What is the effect on output? So what do you want the prescription to the Orissa Millets mission be? You want it to be IRS, DRS, or CRS? Quickly. IRS? That means increase all inputs so that the output of millets increases more than the proportion, correct? But is Professor Mishra happy with increasing inputs? Then how do you reconcile the two? So you have to inform him accordingly. Now, this is the last part for the theoretical quandary. A lot of eminent economists, including this paper that just got published in the Journal of Political Economy, that's the abstract of the paper, which we replicated, is referring to scale 3 times about a paper which is about size. In that paper, and that's also a reading, I believe you may not have the time to go through it as of now, but do read that, please. You realize that the implications are for the farm size productivity, right? But the interpretation is about scale. Having just seen the fundamental distinction between scale and size, you have to be alert about eminent researchers also interchangeably using size and scale. So the next time you see that, you say, hey, they're different. In fact, even the traditional literature I cited, a lot of these eminent scholars, they have been interchangeably using size and scale. So there is a very interesting space where size and scale will interact. That was a homework question I gave, by the way, is what is the relationship between these two elasticities? If anybody can give me an answer by end of the day, you will get a prize. And the idea here is a simple way to look at it. What is productivity? Is output per area in our case, output per a specific input, right? But what is efficiency? If efficiency had to be same as productivity, if numerator is output, what should have in the denominator? The same. But here, there is something called maximum feasible output. What could you achieve given the technological feasibility and so on? This is where many of your believe master's students as well as doctoral scholars will perhaps start working with something called a stochastic frontier analysis and a DEA. Does anybody know what is DEA? Data involvement analysis, right? They're two different measures, but they deal with efficiency. So you have to understand that when you talk about technical efficiency, you're talking about allocative efficiency. There's another relative term there, both at the economic level as well as the firm level. Do not confuse that with what? The same rule applies. When you work with productivity, do not confuse it to be efficiency. When you work with efficiency, do not confuse it with productivity. And more importantly, productivity is a quantitative phenomenon. The output area you divide it. But what happens with efficiency? Though you measure that construct as a quantitative measure or an indicator, it is actually a qualitative indicator of that firm or that farm or that DMU or the decision-making unit. There is a reason why, despite the technology, that individual or that farm, that firm could not reach that frontier, could not be efficient. Maybe there is a management issue or skill issue or capacity issue and so on. So just to remind you, what are the three important theoretical concepts we talked about here? One is that farms or farmers is not a homogeneous concept. So you need to heterogenize that and be explicit about the definitions. Second, size is not equal to scale. Third, productivity is not equal to efficiency. And then some related practical quandaries, and I'll leave you with these quandaries. We've talked about the issue with measuring area. So new researchers come out say that if the self-reported areas are problematic, go measure area with technology. You have this GPS devices. What does GPS stand for? Global Positioning System Plate. You have alternatives to that. You could use a measuring tape and rope as the Mughals used to do. You could also do that. Very interesting study. So you see, the moment you take into account a correction for the self-reported biases, then you see that the IR vanishes. So this is an open question. You could actually write a new paper or do another study saying, in Kerala, perhaps it doesn't matter. In some states, it matters. Why or why not? The other is about the measurement of yield. There are reports of over-reporting your yields in small plots and under-reporting it in large plots. So hence, then the denominator works out differently, the numerator works out differently. So this whole exercise becomes very dodgy in that sense. And a kind of important issue that all referees are going to bother you with is how did you account for the endogeneity of farm size? And this is where I'll go back to the starting of the session today. I said that was randomized to you. There was no self-selection into farm sizes. There was no sort of other confounding factor. The Sarkar or with this potentially endogenous variable and can only influence the dependent variable through this potentially endogenous variable. What do you call such variables? Hint, instrument. What do you call them? The IVs, right? The instrumental variables or the instruments. So what you have to now start thinking about is, you tell me, you write, maybe a longish letter, I'll be happy with it. What is a good instrument for farm size? After you do that, I'll tell you, hey, there are need for instruments for your inputs also. Fertilizer is endogenous. Pesticides we talked about is endogenous. So you see, this whole question about farm size productivity is mired in issues of endogeneity. And that is one area I want scholars from CDS and those who are also listening and the online board, you should think through carefully. Quickly on the replication issues, and in fact, thanks to Professor Srijit Mishra and Rahul Singh to have contributed to some of the ongoing work as of now, is that we found on the right you have our results, on the left you have the published results in the Journal of Political Economy. Even the land is not replicable. The land sizes are not replicable. All of you understand what is a CDF, a cumulative distribution function. So why should we use that? Would you like to answer? What is the advantage of plotting a CDF? On the x-axis, you have that variable, let's say land. On the y-axis, you have the probability of that unit being observed, that level being observed, right? So see, at some point they are flattening out at 1, the symptoms, right? And then they're increasing, decreasing. For instance, at 10 acres for the plot in the left, who can interpret how to read that graph? At area of 10 acres, you go up, you meet this dashed line, and you go to the legend. It says land holdings from the sample of Equiset. Equiset has land holdings from sample as well as census of the village. So this is the sample. There's also plot here. So who can interpret this value of, let's say, at 10 acres around 0.6? And in our graph, you go to the same thing. We'll go to this own area sample, which is the green one. So at around 10, our value is around 0.8. The published work and our work are not only having huge variation in levels, but also in the probabilistic distribution. It's in fact nothing interesting if somebody understands the frequency distribution. If you look at a histogram, this is the probabilistic representation of that. So read the y-axis as densities. That's why it's called a cumulative density function. That means by the time you move from 9 to 10, you add on those probabilities that were before 10, right? So that's why it's a cumulative. And if you add up everything, they should all cluster at 1 in that sense. So this is a telltale sign of an issue with the paper, right? You take do summary statistics, the descriptive statistics, and you do more advanced plots. I'm not even doing modeling as of now. So visually inspect that, be careful about what they have reported. In fact, I'm not sure, Professor Tiago, is there access to JPE, Okay, then you could please share the replication files that I'll share, and then you can see where the students found simulations. So what happens when you publish a paper these days in a very reputed journal? So the journal would ask you to submit replication files. These are like your do files, but you do not give out everything that you did for your work. So basically you see these tables and graphs. Can we, using the raw data, that link or the data might be shared, and the basic file that is shared, can we replicate that finding? So when we did that, it's not happening for any of the important results. And this is the U-shaped relationship that they concluded between the profit per acre of land and the area. There are again different areas. See, there's a U-shape here. Can you see that? This is a paper that was published in the Journal of Political Economy, right? When we took the raw data, this is the U-shape we found. We use the same Loess smoother. So it is one category of smoothing. So there's a lot of non-parametric mumbo jumbo that you need to be aware of. Then you realize that you use the same data, you use the same variables, you try to convert them very carefully. If they're saying we use this real value in the sense we use this indices like CPI, use the same indices. Do not use different indicators or indices and say, hey, they're not matching. Just say whatever they have done, you do that, but you see that, well, we found this and the published work found this. If a term paper would have come to us with this claiming to be a U-shaped, your grade would have been something similar to that, pretty much filled out above the unfinished part of the U, right? So what you realize is, to conclude, there's an exciting area of research waiting for you to really have a conversation with if you're not deep diving into it. So if you deep dive, be careful about the theoretical concerns, be careful about the practical concerns that you have discussed. Replication issues will emerge. Even the way we have replicated, if that goes to review, there might be concerns, which is the way science progresses. That skepticism, that scrutiny is important. And the policy implications you should also think through. In fact, you as a cohort is well versed with the challenges with the mainstream development discourse. If you simply say, oh, this is a technological issue, let's apply technological solutions. Then somebody says, look, STS aspects haven't been taken care of, the science, technology, society considerations. So then you have to really think about not only fine-tuning the math, the economics, the sociology, political. In fact, the other day I was speaking to Professor Jaisili. So he gave very interesting insights about how the anthropology or the insights from anthropology could inform our understanding of power structures and all. then we believe those aspects also need to be addressed in mainstream economics. If you are coming at it from a heterodoxy perspective, right, then you also need to strengthen your arguments. Whether the land reforms agenda, which is unfinished in India, what should be the trajectory of that? There are some recent studies and policy discussions around roof farming. In fact, one in the context of Kerala, if any of you is aware of. Then you realize that are group farms more productive than individual farms? Then what is the policy implication? FPOs. So what about the farmer producer organization as an alternative to the cooperative system, right? The political economy, the rent seeking, the elite capture that we see in cooperatives, is that not going to happen in FPOs and so on? So in some future work, and some of it is in fact ongoing, we're looking at the tenancy and productivity implications of tenancy. Equiset is very rich data. So there's an interesting paper, this detail isn't shared here. It's the total factor productivity model, the TFP model. So the argument there is farm size is not causing this, it is rather the TFP which you are not measuring. The GIS analysis, as Professor Tabu mentioned, so we have set up a geospatial information science and engineering hub at IIT Bombay. So the objective is to train researchers, scholars about mostly the open source, the free and open source softwares and techniques in GIS. In fact, 26th to 28th of May, we're having an online 3-day workshop on using GIS for river mapping. So I welcome all of you to participate in that workshop, both for faculty and students. The nominal fee of 100 rupees is what you have to pay to attend that. So we'll introduce you to the basics of something called QGIS, which is a free and open source GIS. There are a lot of proprietary software, so that's something is a call that you take. But eventually, over the next 5 years, our objective is to scale up education about GIS tools. In fact, Professor Tirtha has written a very interesting paper about geospatial aspects in agriculture. If some of you have not read that, do read that. But how can you improve visualizations? What sort of geospatial metrics and analytics could be brought about, right? Clustering in agriculture productivity is an important topic. Policy implications again. So what you have to start thinking is, then there are others who are also working on village level studies. We have been running a village level study. I was part of another in Palanpur, a study that kind of has continued for the past 70 years now. And it's going into the next round, hopefully. Then perhaps in our lifetime, we'll see 100 years of studies on this village. Then since we are here, I talked about the Cambridge controversy, thanks to Professor John Robinson. Think about the issues in political economy, issues in terms of the macroeconomics of all the isms that you've been introduced to and not introduced to. That could also contribute to this literature. And my hope is that some of you will reach out to me or maybe tell me, okay, how could you get further information? Or maybe if I was not right about certain aspects, I'd be happy to be corrected. Thank you all for a patient and active participation in this sessions. All the best. Thanks. Over to you, Professor Gaurav. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Sarthak. I think that was an expansive presentation on a particularly important issue. I think these definitional aspects, when you present, it's okay. When you work with him, it is frustrating. Like he'll ask, what is this, what is that, what happened? We are like, oh, no. Right. So anyways, like, so I think we are 5, so we can have 2 questions maybe. That's then we'll close the session.
You can take one from the physical.
Yeah, one from the one here maybe. Anybody has a question or a comment? Yeah, Vinod now.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
My question is, do you agree with
Yeah, in fact, within same clusters, you'll find a lot of positive relationships. Even across countries, new studies will find positive.
If this is so,
Yeah.
then if we go to the arm, there is a provision. There is a provision, right? Like corporate sector will come, they will take a group of farmers,
Yeah.
they will dictated, somehow, partially, maybe may not be absolute sense they are dictating, but in the partial sense they are dictating that we have to cultivate this because of their small farmers. They don't have the bargaining power. In that sense, we are saying that we are supporting that to go further, we are enlarging the concept. May not be in absolute sense, but somehow in the partial sense.
Big is better in that sense. Yeah.
In the partial enlarging the concept. That may enhance the productivity. What about the farmers? Their welfare, their freedoms to choose or freedom.
Yeah. So what's the name? Vinod. So thanks, Vinod. It's a great question. So in fact, that's also been a policy dilemma for us because we advise. We wear two hats. One is the Center for Policy Studies, which is kind of left-leaning. The other is I teach at the business school of management. So what you realize is School of Management students will say, sir, how can we really have this large corporatization of the agriculture sector so that there is win-win situation for all? And the CPA students also, to a large extent, there are variations in CPAs also, but you realize that the welfare question has to be given importance. But we realize that it's not an easy question to answer because it's a very context-specific question. So you have to realize that for a specific region, having the local ecological knowledge of the farmers, preserving that is important. And you have to also realize, are you introducing new cropping systems? Are you, in a way, introducing them to new contractual forms? It's not necessary that that's going to be negative. What you have to work out is that you cannot have one blanket solution for the rest of the country, if that thing works. We have seen examples where it has worked greatly. In fact, there's another student who is working with the FPOs and has found out that in certain models of FPOs are prone to fail. Certain models are prone to succeed and certain are prone to just survive. If you figure out that this model of FPOs, after all, they're introducing new contractual forms, right? So this is a new order in that society or that organizational context you're talking about. And if you say the question of choice, are the farmers themselves coming to be members of this FPOs, or there's coercion like our first question? So it is something you need to dabble with, but there is no right or wrong answer as such. So you have to evaluate the pros and cons, but be careful about the welfare implications. And I also draw upon the multidimensional poverty equivalence here. It's a multidimensional context. So income is not just welfare, right? If one group is saying the incomes have doubled or grown by 4 times, no matter how many times the cost has grown, so you have to realize that you have to bring in other aspects also. So then you have to engage with the literature, with the arguments, with the discourse, and the policy implications there. So one thing you'll realize, the certain problems that were wicked problems, they may not have a solution. They may have a very difficult solution, but they may not have a solution. So therein lies a theoretical challenge to you. Very good to have conversations about it. Thanks. Any other question from the online participants, please? Yeah, so I see your hands raised.
Any other questions from here? Maybe one more question from here. Okay, then maybe we'll discuss it over tea. That's only for offline participants. So yeah, so
But the tea test is for everyone.
yeah. So let's have tea. The next session is at 5:30, and it will be online again. Okay, so let's break for tea.
Thank you all. Thanks, Professor Dago. Thank you. Bye.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah. So take it. So 22 or the
Yes, any question? Okay, if I know raise hands, there is
only one.
fine.
Okay.
So let's meet at 5:30.
Yeah, 5:30.
Yeah.